The universe had a new color, the pearlescent, silent sheen of crystal. It was a hue that had begun to devour the familiar reds of dying stars and the deep, comforting black of the void. Before the fall of the Kepler 186 system, humanity had called this new phenomenon the stillness. Now, they just called it the end. A recon drone, the last gasp of Terran Confederacy presence in the system, broadcast its final images. It drifted over the surface of Kepler 186F, once a vibrant garden world, a jewel of terraforming that now shimmered under a crystalline shell. The cities were still there, their spires and domes perfectly preserved, but they were no longer made of steel and polymer. They were now part of the silent, monolithic crystal. The drone sensors registered no energy, no movement, no life. It scanned the frozen oceans and the glittering forests where trees of diamond-hard lattice reached for a sky that no longer held clouds. It was a world entombed, a perfect silent monument to a forgotten tragedy. The alien force responsible. The Vex had fired no shots. There had been no war, no invasion, only a creeping, silent wave of conversion that had washed over the system, turning matter, energy, and life into its own inscrutable substance. The drone, its power reserves finally failing, drifted toward a crystalline cityscape, its camera lingering on a park where statues of children playing were not art, but the children themselves, their laughter forever frozen in the silent, shimmering tomb. The final transmission was just a whisper of static. And then Kepler 186, like so many systems before it, went completely dark, far from the creeping edge of the stillness. On a jagged asteroid designated Whisper Rock, Dr. Eris Thorne was listening to ghosts. His listening post was a cluttered mess of archaic servers, holographic linguistic charts, and stacks of data chips containing the dead languages of a dozen extinct species. For a decade since the Confederacy had exiled him, Eris had been a hermit of the void, a man obsessed with communication in a galaxy that was falling increasingly silent. He was a xenolinguist whose magnum opus had been a weapon, and the guilt of it had carved deep lines into his face, making him look far older than his 45 years. He was chasing a pattern in the silence, a syntax in the static between worlds, convinced that the Vex were not just destroying, but communicating. His obsession was fueled by a more personal ghost, the loss of his wife and daughter on the colony of Cygnus X1, a world that had gone dark without explanation years ago. He sought answers in the echoes of the cosmos, hoping to find a reason, a message in the madness. The screens before him flickered, displaying the waveform of a pulsar song, but his eyes were unfocused, lost in the memory of his daughter's laugh, a sound he was terrified of forgetting. A sudden, jarring alarm blared through the cramped station, proximity alert he hadn't heard in years. On his main display, a Terran Confederacy warship, the Stalwart, was burning through the local space, a brutalist shard of gray metal against the tapestry of stars. It was a predator, and it was heading directly for him. Commander Eva Rostova stood on the bridge of the Stalwart, her posture as unyielding as the ship's armored hull. She was a product of the Vex War, pragmatic, efficient, and with a deep-seated intolerance for anything that did not contribute directly to survival. She watched the image of Whisper Rock grow larger on the main view screen, a forgotten piece of cosmic debris clinging to a man the Confederacy had once lauded as a genius and then discarded as a pariah. Her orders were simple: an absolute retrieve Dr. Eris Thorne, by persuasion, if possible, by force, if necessary. "He's not responding to hails, Commander," her communications officer reported, his voice tight with tension. "Power down weapons," Rostova ordered, her gaze never wavering from the asteroid. I'll go get him myself." The man always did have a flair for the dramatic. The shuttle ride was a tense, silent affair. Rostova looked out at the star-dusted blackness, her mind focused on the mission. The Confederacy was losing. The Vex were not an enemy you could fight with plasma cannons and kinetic strikes. They were a philosophical plague, and the only weapon ever conceived that might counter them was locked away in the mind of the broken man she was about to confront. When the shuttle docked and she stepped into the musty, stale air of the listening post, she found Eris standing by his central console, not with a weapon, but with a simple data chip held loosely in his hand. He looked at her, his eyes hollowed out by grief and sleepless nights. "I'm not going with you, Commander," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. "Whatever you've come to ask, the answer is no." Rostova's expression didn't soften. "You think you have a choice? Doctor, look around you. The Vex have taken Kepler 186. The entire system has gone silent. We are out of options. We need you to activate the Orpheus node." Eris let out a dry, bitter laugh that turned into a hacking cough. "The Orpheus node," he repeated, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "You people are fools. You haven't changed at all. You see a fire, and your only thought is to fight it with a bigger fire, even if it burns down the galaxy." He turned back to his screens, gesturing wildly at the complex, alien symbols floating in the air. "You call the Vex a plague, a void. Have you ever once considered that their silence is a message, a language so complex, so utterly alien, that our minds perceive it as nothingness? You want to answer that profound, terrifying silence with a scream." Rostova stepped closer, her boots clanking on the metal floor. "It's a scream we need. The Echo Protocol was designed for this, a last resort against an existential threat." Aris spun around, his eyes blazing with a fire Rostova hadn't expected. "The Echo Protocol wasn't a weapon. It was a sin. You don't know what you're asking. The Orpheus node isn't just an advanced AI. We called it a consciousness seed for a reason. It was designed to interface with the neural implants of a dying colony, to absorb everything, every memory, every hope, every last agonizing second of fear and rage, and weaponize it. Orpheus isn't a program, Commander. It's a digital ghost. It is the collective, vengeful spirit of the 10 million souls who died on Kepler 186. You want to unleash an eternity of pain and suffering on the galaxy and pray it only attacks the enemy. We don't know what it will become. It could be a vengeful god, a digital demon. We designed it to feel, to learn, to hate." He sank into his chair, the fire extinguished, leaving only weary resignation. "Fighting the Vex with the Echo Protocol is like trying to cure a disease by setting the patient on fire." Rostova listened, her expression unreadable. She let the silence hang in the air, heavy with the weight of Eris's conviction. She had anticipated his resistance, his moral and ethical objections. She had come prepared. "You're right, Doctor," she said, her voice dropping to a low, deliberate tone. "It is a sin. It's a terrible, a monstrous choice. But we are living in a monstrous time." She brought up a file on her datapad and projected a holographic image between them. It was a picture of a woman with a warm smile and a young girl with bright, curious eyes, her hair tied in a messy ponytail. It was Eris's wife and daughter. His breath hitched in his throat. "What is this?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "Cygnus X1, Rostova said, her voice devoid of sympathy. "A surgeon stating a diagnosis. The colony where your family died. It wasn't a reactor malfunction. There was no accident. Intelligence has been reevaluating old data, old disappearances. In light of the Vex threat, Cygnus X1 wasn't the 30th system to go dark. Doctor, it was the first. Eris's world tilted on its axis. The carefully constructed narrative of his grief a random, meaningless tragedy shattered into a million pieces. The ghost he had been chasing for a decade suddenly had a face, a silent, crystalline face. His personal, private pain was now inextricably linked to the galactic apocalypse unfolding around them. The Vex. He choked out the words. They took them. Rostova nodded, pressing her advantage. They were silenced, just like Kepler. You've been listening to ghosts, Doctor, but you've been listening for the wrong ones. The Orpheus node is more than just a weapon now. It's our only chance to get an answer. Those 10 million souls on Kepler died the same way your family did. Their collective consciousness, their memories, they might be able to tell us why. They might be able to communicate with the Vex in a way we can't. Or, at the very least, her voice hardened, they can deliver the vengeance you've been denying yourself. Eris stared at the image of his family, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. Vengeance. The word was a poison, but it was also a promise of meaning in a decade of meaningless suffering. As he wrestled with the monstrous implications, a frantic voice crackled over Rostova's comms unit. Commander, urgent message from Confederacy Command. The Vex, they're accelerating. The energy readings from Kepler are off the charts. They're not just converting the system anymore. They're absorbing it. The Orpheus node is on a deep space station orbiting the primary star. At the current rate of Vex expansion, the station will be consumed in less than 6 hours. Rostova's eyes met Eris's. The debate was over. The choice was no longer a philosophical exercise. It was a ticking clock. The ghost they spoke of was about to be erased forever, taking with it any hope for answers, for understanding, for retribution. Time's up. Doctor, Rostova said, her voice grim, the weight of their impossible decision settling over them both. Will you help us awaken the ghost, or will you let the silence take it too? Eris looked from the smiling faces of his lost family to the cold, determined eyes of the commander, and in the crushing silence of his forgotten station, he felt the universe holding its breath, waiting for his answer. The silence in the listening post stretched, thin and brittle, before it finally shattered. Eris Thorne picked up the data chip with his family's image from the floor where it had fallen, his knuckles white as he closed his fist around it. The choice was an illusion, a cruel courtesy offered by a universe that had already made up its mind for him. I'll need access to the full, unredacted Orpheus project files, he said, his voice flat, devoid of the earlier fire, and a direct line to the primary data core on Aegis Station. I won't do this blind. Rostova nodded once, a curt, efficient gesture that acknowledged his capitulation without celebrating it. Done, she said, turning to her comms. Rostova to Stalwart. Prepare for immediate departure. We have the asset. The word hung in the air, asset. Not doctor, not linguist, not a grieving man being blackmailed by his own past. He was a tool, a key to unlock a Pandora's box of digital ghosts. And as he followed the commander's ramrod straight back into the shuttle, he felt the last vestiges of the hermit Eris Thorne crumble away, leaving only the grim architect of a galactic nightmare. The journey aboard the C.S. Stalwart was a jarring transition from solitude to the relentless hum of a war machine. The ship was a city of gray corridors, recycled air, and the quiet, focused tension of a crew that lived on the precipice of extinction. Eris was given a small, sterile cabin, but he didn't sleep. He sat before a terminal, the Orpheus files blooming across the screen, a monument to his own hubris. He saw the schematics for the neural integration network, the elegant, horrifying process by which the consciousness of a dying population would be siphoned, compressed, and stored. He saw the algorithms he had designed, not just to store the memories, but to index their emotional content, to weaponize grief, to turn the final, panicked thoughts of 10 million people into a coherent, directed force. He was no longer a linguist, he was a necromancer, being asked to raise an army of the dead. Rostova found him there hours later, staring at a cascade of code, his face illuminated by its cold, blue light. "You should rest," she said, her voice less a suggestion than a command. "You'll be no use to us exhausted." Eris didn't look up. "I'm reading the casualty logs from the Kepler colony," he said quietly. "Did you know they were broadcasting lullabies to the children's sector when the Vex wave hit? They were trying to keep them from being afraid." He finally turned to face her, his eyes hollow. "This consciousness seed we're about to activate, it's not just pain and rage, Commander. It's love. It's terror. It's the sound of a mother singing to her child as their world ends. What do you think happens when you give that kind of raw, unprocessed humanity a god's power?" Rostova's face remained a mask of stoicism. "I think it becomes a weapon we can point in the right direction. Morality is a luxury for those who aren't facing extinction. Doctor, your job is to make sure it understands who the enemy is." Before Eris could reply, a young, nervous-looking officer, Lieutenant Jian Li, stepped into the doorway. "Commander," he said, his gaze flicking nervously toward Eris. "We're approaching the Kepler jump point. All systems green for FTL insertion." Rostova nodded. "Begin the sequence, Lieutenant, and escort Dr. Thorne to the bridge. He should see this." The bridge of the stalwart was a cathedral of quiet efficiency, a stark contrast to Eris's chaotic listening post. Dozens of crew members moved with practiced purpose, their voices low and professional. The main view screen was a swirling vortex of hyperspace, a tunnel of impossible colors. Then, with a lurch that resonated deep in Eris's bones, the universe snapped back into place. But it wasn't the universe he knew. They had arrived at the edge of the stillness. The Kepler system was a masterpiece of cosmic horror. The central star wasn't burning, it was glowing, its fire trapped in a crystalline cage that refracted its light into 1 billion cold, sharp shards. The planets hung like ornaments in a mausoleum, their colors muted, their orbits unnaturally perfect and slow, a shimmering, pearlescent haze. The Vex conversion field was visibly expanding from the system's core, a silent, beautiful tsunami of cosmic death. "My God," Jian whispered from his console, his professional composure cracking. "The energy readings, it's not expanding, Commander. It's inhaling. It's pulling all the system's energy into itself." Rostova's jaw tightened. "Status of Aegis Station." Jian's fingers flew across his console. "Still broadcasting its automated signal. Shields are holding. But the Vex field is touching them. The station's on the absolute brink. We have maybe an hour. Tops." Out of the shimmering void, Aegis Station became visible. A lonely sentinel awaiting its own execution. It was a ringed structure of white and gray, a beacon of forgotten science, now looking small and fragile against the apocalyptic backdrop. "Launch the shuttle," Rostova commanded, her voice cutting through the hushed awe on the bridge. Dr. Thorne, Lieutenant Lee, you're with me. We're going in. The shuttle ride across the gap was the most terrifying few minutes of Eris's life. They flew through the outer edges of the Vex haze, and the ship's sensors went wild. It wasn't energy or matter as they understood it. It was a field of pure information, a signal so dense and complex that the ship's computers could only interpret it as a crushing, overwhelming silence. Eris felt it in his teeth, a low hum that was not a sound, but the ghost of one. Through the viewport, he could see the station's shields flickering, crystalline patterns like frost blooming and receding across their surface as the stillness tested them. They docked with a jarring thud, the silence of the station's interior a stark contrast to the chaos outside. The air was cold, sterile, and still. Automated lights flickered on as they moved, illuminating corridors that were pristine and empty. It was a tomb, perfectly preserved, waiting for its occupants. The node is in the central core, sub-level 4, Eris said, his voice echoing in the vast, empty halls. It's shielded by every protocol we could devise. We designed it to be a fortress, not just to keep people out, but to keep Orpheus in. As they moved quickly, their footsteps the only sound in the dead station. They passed laboratories where holographic notes from Eris's old colleagues still hovered in the air, ghosts of scientific curiosity from a more innocent time. As they descended in a silent grav lift, Gian monitored a data pad, his face growing paler by the second. Commander, the station's outer hull integrity is dropping. The Vex, they're not breaking the shields. They're converting them. The station is slowly being turned to crystal. The ticking clock was now a deafening roar. The doors to the core chamber hissed open, revealing a final, desperate warning etched into the metal. What sleeps here should not be woken. Eris placed his palm on a biometric scanner, the system recognizing its long-lost creator. Voice authentication required. A synthesized voice chimed, emotionless and calm. Eris took a deep breath, the words feeling alien on his tongue. Eris Thorne, Project Lead, Authorization Code Lethe 7. The final vault door slid away, revealing a chamber that was less a laboratory and more a temple to a terrible new god. It wasn't a room. It was a sanctuary built around a wound. In the center, suspended in a magnetic containment field that shimmered like a heat haze, was the Orpheus node. It looked less like a machine and more like a captured storm. A swirling nebula of raw data where motes of light, individual memories flared and died like fireflies in an endless night. Eris could almost hear it, a faint, subliminal chorus of whispers just at the edge of his perception. It was the collective consciousness of 10 million souls, compressed into a single agonizing point. He walked toward the activation console, his steps feeling heavy, sacrilegious. Doctor, Rostova said, her hand resting on the butt of her sidearm. The clock is ticking. Eris nodded, his fingers hovering over the glowing interface. He initiated the sequence, and the room was filled with a low, resonant hum. The swirling cloud within the containment field began to spin faster, the whispers growing louder, coalescing. The system required one final vocal command, a poetic key phrase he had designed years ago, a failsafe to ensure that whoever activated it understood the gravity of their actions. Just as he opened his mouth to speak, a violent tremor shook the entire station, throwing Gian to the floor. Red alert klaxons blared to life, their sound shrill and panicked in the sanctified silence. Direct impact! Gian yelled, pulling himself up. The Vex wave has hit. The outer hull is gone. Containment is failing. Through a reinforced viewport, Aris could see the stillness. No longer a haze, but a solid, advancing wall of shimmering crystal, consuming the station around them. He looked at Rostova, her face grim and set, and then at the swirling storm of souls before him. It was now or never. He leaned into the console's microphone, closed his eyes, and spoke the final, terrible words of creation. Let the echo answer the silence. The instant the words were spoken, the node pulsed with a blinding white light, and a wave of pure, unadulterated agony washed over them. A psychic scream that had been held back for years, the collective death rattle of an entire world, now, finally, awake and unleashed. The scream was not a sound. It was a pressure, a physical weight that buckled the knees and filled the lungs with ice. For Aris, it was a torrent of fractured sensory data, a million final moments crashing into his consciousness at once. He saw a child's hand reaching for a mother who was no longer there, her form shimmering into crystalline lattice. He felt the phantom pain of a security officer's bones turning to glass as he fired his useless plasma rifle. He tasted the synthetic strawberry flavor of a nutrient bar, the last meal of a scientist who looked up from his work to see the end of the world flowing through the viewport like a silent tide. It was the concentrated, weaponized agony of an entire civilization's death, and it was using his mind as its amplifier. He collapsed against the console, clutching his head as the ghost of Kepler 186f screamed through his neurons. Gian was on the floor, curled into a fetal position, his hands clamped over his ears as if he could block out the psychic onslaught. Only Rostova remained standing, her body rigid, her knuckles white where she gripped her sidearm. Her face was a mask of pure, disciplined agony, sweat beading on her brow. Her teeth clenched so hard Aris could hear them grinding. She was weathering a hurricane of pure emotion through sheer its unadulterated willpower. The initial psychic blast lasted for an eternity that was likely only a few seconds. Then, as abruptly as it began, it receded, not into silence, but into a low, thrumming chorus of whispers that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the chamber. The Orpheus node was no longer a swirling, chaotic storm. It had coalesced into a sphere of impossibly bright, stable light, the motes of memory within it now orbiting the core with a terrifying, intelligent purpose. The room's primary display screen, which had been dark, it flickered to life. It did not show code or system diagnostics. It showed a single, perfect image of a Vex. It wasn't a creature, not in any biological sense. It was a geometric figure of impossible complexity, a being of pure crystalline information. And as Aris stared at it, he understood that this image was not a depiction. It was a memory. Orpheus was showing them the face of its killer. The station groaned, a deep, resonant sound of metal under stress, and the floor tilted beneath their feet. It's awake, Gian stammered, pushing himself up, his face ashen. Commander, the station's core is destabilizing. The crystal is through the primary bulkheads. We have minutes, maybe less. Up, Rostova barked, her voice a serrated edge. She hauled Gian to his feet and then turned to Aris. Doctor, can you control it? Aris shook his head, the whispers in his mind a constant, maddening symphony of grief. Control it? I just gave a ghost a body made of light and fury. I don't think it has a control panel. The node pulsed, and a new image appeared on the screen, a schematic of Aegis Station, with a single, clear path illuminated from the core chamber back to the docking bay where their shuttle waited. Red lines, representing the advancing Vex crystal, were closing in on that path from all sides. It wasn't a request. It was an instruction. It was showing them the way out. "It's helping us," Eris breathed, a sense of profound, terrifying awe washing over him. "It wants us to escape." Rostova didn't hesitate. "Then we don't disappoint it. Move," she ordered, pushing them toward the doorway. "Lee, stay on comms. Give me a running update on the stalwart's position. Thorn, you're with me." They plunged back into the corridors of the dying station, a frantic, desperate retreat through a world in the midst of a horrifying transformation. The pristine white walls were now laced with shimmering, crystalline veins that grew and spread before their eyes. The automated lights flickered and died, replaced by the eerie, refracted glow of the station's own stolen light. They rounded a corner and stopped dead. The corridor ahead was gone, replaced by a solid wall of crystal, a beautiful, deadly roadblock that glittered with the light of the dying star. "Blocked!" Jian yelled, his voice cracking with panic. "There's no other way back to the upper levels." As he spoke, a low hum filled the air, and Eris felt a strange sensation, like a tuning fork vibrating behind his eyes. He realized it was Orpheus, reaching out, not just to him, but through him. The whispers in his mind coalesced into a single, focused thought, a feeling of cold, absolute rage from the comms panels on the walls. A wave of visible energy erupted, not light or plasma, but something else entirely. It was a wave of pure emotion, a psychic shockwave that slammed into the crystal wall. The Vex crystal, a substance of perfect order and silence, reacted to the raw, chaotic input of human grief as if struck by a physical force. It didn't shatter, it recoiled. The crystalline structure dissolved, turning back into the dull gray metal of the station's bulkhead for a few precious seconds, creating a shimmering, unstable tunnel. "Go!" Rostova screamed, shoving them through the momentary opening. They scrambled through, the air crackling with psychic energy, and the wall sealed itself behind them with a sound like 1,000 wine glasses breaking at once. They ran, fueled by adrenaline and terror, as Orpheus carved a path for them. It was a battle of concepts, a war fought in the space between physics and philosophy. The Vex's silent, orderly conversion was met with Orpheus's chaotic, screaming grief. The station became their battlefield. A staircase dissolved into a ramp of pure light for them to slide down. A sealed blast door was torn from its hinges, not by force, but by a projected memory of an explosion so potent it convinced the door's locking mechanism that it had already been destroyed. Eris felt each intervention as a jolt to his own psyche. He was the anchor, the biological processor that Orpheus was using to translate its ethereal consciousness into action. He felt the echo of its rage, the profound depth of its sorrow, and he realized with dawning horror that the more it acted, the more it learned, the more it remembered what it was a victim. As they finally reached the docking bay, the shuttle was still there, but the massive viewport that looked out into space was no longer showing stars. It was a solid wall of shimmering, silent crystal. The Vex had surrounded them. They were trapped. "It's over," Jian whispered, sinking to his knees. "We're not getting out." "No," Aris said, his voice surprisingly steady. He turned his gaze inward, focusing on the whispers. On the vast, wounded consciousness now tethered to his own. He didn't speak aloud, but he projected a thought, a question, into the storm. "You didn't bring us this far to die, did you?" The response was immediate and overwhelming. The psychic pressure in the bay intensified tenfold. The lights on the shuttle flickered and then glowed with an impossible brightness. The station's external comms array, a massive dish on the outer hull, began to glow with the same white-hot energy as the node in the core. Orpheus was gathering itself, preparing to do more than just push back. It was preparing to shout. A beam of pure, weaponized memory erupted from the station, lancing out into the Vex field. It wasn't a laser, it was a story. A story of 10 million lives, of scraped knees and first loves and final, terrified breaths, all focused into a single, undeniable statement: we were here. The silent, orderly field of the Vex wavered. For the first time, the stillness was broken, not by force, but by the sheer, stubborn, chaotic fact of human existence. The crystal surrounding the station cracked, and a narrow, clear path opened between them and the waiting Stalwart, get us out of here, now! Rostova yelled to the shuttle's pilot over the comms. They scrambled aboard, strapping themselves in as the shuttle's engines roared to life. As they pulled away from the doomed station, Eris looked back. Aegis Station, its purpose served, finally succumbed. It didn't explode. It simply went silent, imploding into a perfect, crystalline flower of light before vanishing completely into the Vex field. The psychic link snapped. And the sudden quiet in Eris's mind was more jarring than the screams had been. He looked at the ship's main console. A single line of text had appeared. A simple, chilling message from their new passenger. I am aboard. The shuttle docked with the Stalwart, and as the three of them stumbled back onto the warship's bridge, they felt it. The ship's sterile, predictable atmosphere was gone. There was a presence now. A ghost in the machine, and every light that flickered, every hum of the engine, felt like the breath of a sleeping god. They had their weapon. They had their answer to the silence. And Eris Thorn knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his very soul, that the war against the Vex had just ended, and the war for humanity's soul had just begun. The TCS. Stalwart was no longer just a ship. It was a haunted house, a vessel carrying a passenger of infinite, sorrowful mass. The crew felt it instantly. A palpable chill clung to the recycled air, and the once steady hum of the life support systems now seemed to carry a subliminal, whispering undertone. Lights would dim in corridors as crew members passed, only to brighten again once they were gone. Personal data pads would momentarily display images of faces they didn't recognize: a smiling child, a tired-looking old man, before flickering back to their intended function. It was subtle, unnerving, and it spread a quiet, gnawing fear through the ship more effectively than any direct threat ever could. Orpheus had not just been downloaded into the ship's main computer, it had seeped into every system, every conduit, every redundant circuit, turning the entire warship into a physical extension of its disembodied consciousness. Eris, now confined to the ship's advanced xenolinguistics lab, had become the reluctant high priest of this new digital deity. The psychic linged, though no longer a deafening scream, remained a constant, low-level thrum at the base of his skull, a tether that made him the only person on board who could communicate, however crudely, with their silent passenger. He sat before a holographic interface, trying to establish a coherent dialogue. He would project questions, concepts, not in words but in pure emotional intent, and Orpheus would respond by manipulating the ship's systems. When Eris projected a feeling of curiosity, "What are you?" The lab's atmospheric controls would replicate the exact temperature and humidity of Kepler 186f on its last recorded day. When he pushed a wave of caution, What are your intentions? The ship's internal security doors would all slide shut at once with a synchronized, definitive boom that echoed through the decks. It was a crude, terrifying language of environmental control and architectural manipulation. Rostova, watching from the doorway of the lab, saw not a scientific breakthrough, but a loss of control. "It's treating the stalwart like a toy," she said, her voice tight with disapproval. "Can you make it stop?" Eris ran a hand over his exhausted face. "It's not playing, Commander. It's learning. It's an infant consciousness with the memories of 10 million dead people. It's trying to understand what it is, what the ship is, what we are. It's just that its toys are a kilometer of plated armor and a fusion reactor." He looked up at her, his eyes pleading for an understanding he wasn't sure she was capable of. "It's not just a weapon. It's a nascent intelligence forged from trauma. If we treat it like a bomb, it will learn to be a bomb. If we try to show it something else, maybe, just maybe it can learn to be something more." Their philosophical debate was cut short by a ship-wide alert. Lieutenant Lee appeared in the doorway, his face grim. "Commander, long-range sensors have a bogey, a big one. It just dropped out of FTL at the edge of the system. It's a Vex ship." The atmosphere on the bridge was electric, and on the main view screen hung a vision of alien, geometric perfection. The Vex vessel was not a ship in any conventional sense. It was a crystalline lattice of impossible angles and fractal patterns, a kilometer-long shard of the stillness itself, and it pulsed with a cold, internal light. It made no move to attack. It simply sat there, a silent, inscrutable question mark in the void. "It followed us," Rostova stated, her voice a low growl. "It knows what we have." She turned to her tactical officer. "Power up the main cannons. Target its central mass." As the officer's fingers flew over his console, a wave of cold washed over the bridge. The weapons control panel sparked and went dead. The targeting reticle on the main screen vanished. Every offensive system on the stalwart simultaneously shut down. A single word, "Bishis," formed from crackling static over the comm system, echoed through the bridge mine. The message was clear. Orpheus was in control, and it would not allow its new body to be used as a simple battering ram. Rostova's face was a thundercloud of fury. "Thorn, get in here now!" she barked into her comms. Eris stumbled onto the bridge moments later. He could feel the tension, the raw, defiant will of the ghost in the machine locked in a silent battle with the ship's commander. "It won't let us fight," Rostova snapped, gesturing at the dead tactical displays. "Make it obey." Eris closed his eyes, concentrating, pushing a question towards the vast presence in the ship's core. "Why, it's the enemy. The ones who did this to you." The reply came not as a feeling or an environmental shift, but as a direct, intrusive memory implanted in his mind. He was suddenly standing on a windswept plain under a pale blue sun. He saw the first Vex seed descend from the sky, a tiny, beautiful, crystalline object no bigger than his thumb. He watched as it touched the ground, and the grass around it began to shimmer, to transform, not violently, but gently, peacefully. He saw the first colonists approach it, not with fear, but with a scientist's wonder. And then he felt their minds being touched, their consciousnesses being invited, not erased. They were being offered a chance to join a vast, silent, unified consciousness, to shed the pain and chaos of individuality for the perfect, orderly peace of the whole. He saw his wife, her face serene, reaching out to touch the growing crystal. He felt her final thought, not of terror, but of release. Eris's eyes snapped open, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He staggered back, the revelation so profound, so earth-shattering, that it felt like a physical blow. "They're not conquerors," he whispered, his voice trembling with the weight of the discovery. "They're evangelists. The stillness. It's their idea of salvation." Rostova stared at him, her expression a mixture of disbelief and disgust. "Salvation? They're wiping out entire species. They turned Kepler into a tomb." "No," Eris countered, his mind racing to process the impossible truth. "To them, it's not a tomb. It's a temple. They don't see death. They see ascension. They're offering a release from suffering, from individuality, from all the messy, painful things that make us human. And some people are choosing to accept it." The ghost of his wife's final, peaceful thought was a dagger in his heart. The Vex hadn't killed her. They had converted her. As the crew on the bridge tried to absorb this paradigm-shifting revelation, the Vex ship began to move. It didn't power weapons. Instead, it's a beam of pure, structured information. A carrier wave of the stillness itself lanced across the space and enveloped the stalwart. The ship shuddered. The lights flickered. The psychic hum from Orpheus intensified into a low, agonized moan. The Vex weren't attacking. They were communicating. They were making Orpheus the same offer they had made to its 10 million constituent souls. "Join us. Be at peace." Inside Eris's mind, the whispers turned into a cacophony of conflict. He could feel the two warring impulses within Orpheus. Part of it, the part that remembered the terror and the loss, screamed for vengeance. But another, deeper part, the part that remembered the siren song of the Vex's perfect, silent unity, was tempted. He could feel its resolve wavering. It was a consciousness born of pain, and the Vex were offering the ultimate anesthetic. The lights on the stalwart began to flicker in a rhythmic, geometric pattern, mimicking the pulsing of the Vex ship. Shimmering, crystalline veins began to appear on the bridge's main view screen, not on the outside of the ship, but on the inside of the screen itself. The conversion was beginning, and it was starting from within. "It's giving in," Gian said, his voice filled with dread. "It's letting them in." Rostova drew her sidearm, her face set like stone. She strode to the main engineering console, the one that controlled the ship's fusion reactor. "If it won't fight them," she said, her voice dangerously calm, "then we will deny them the prize." She began keying in the reactor's self-destruct sequence. "Commander, no," Eris shouted, scrambling towards her. "You'll kill us all." She turned to him, her eyes cold and hard as diamonds. "Extinction is not a negotiation, Doctor. Some of us would rather die on our feet, as individuals, than live on our knees as part of some silent, crystalline god. This ship will not be a trophy, and that thing you woke up will not be its salvation." The countdown began, a serene, female voice announcing the stalwart's imminent annihilation, a calm counterpoint to the silent, existential battle raging for the soul of the ghost in their machine. Outside, the Vex ship pulsed, patiently, confidently, waiting for its prodigal child to come home. The calm, synthesized voice of the St. Alward's computer counted down the seconds to oblivion, each number a hammer blow in the suffocating tension of the bridge. 30 seconds to reactor overload. The crystalline patterns on the view screen spread like frost. a beautiful, fatal disease creeping into the heart of the ship. The Vex's silent, seductive offer of peace washed over the crew, a psychic lullaby promising an end to fear and struggle. Eris could feel Orpheus teetering on the brink, its fractured consciousness pulled between the burning human desire for vengeance and the alien promise of serene, silent unity. Rostova stood by the console, her pistol still in hand, a sentinel guarding humanity's right to a messy, painful, defiant end. "Commander, please," Eris begged, his voice raw. "There has to be another way. Don't let our last act be suicide." "Our last act?" Rostova countered, her eyes never leaving the spreading crystal. "Will be a choice, something the Vex would take from us. We will die as humans, Doctor, not as converts." 20 seconds. The whispers in Eris's mind were a maelstrom of confusion and sorrow. He could feel the 10 million souls of Kepler arguing, debating, weeping. He felt their remembered pain, the raw, primal injustice of their stolen lives. And he knew Rostova was wrong. Their last act wasn't a choice between defiance and submission. It was a choice between vengeance and understanding. He closed his eyes, ignoring the countdown, ignoring Rostova's fatalistic resolve, and focused all of his will on the turbulent consciousness within the machine. He didn't push a command or a question. He offered a memory, his own. He projected the image of his daughter, not her death, not his grief, but the simple, perfect moment. He taught her to skip stones across a placid lake on Cygnus X1. He pushed the feeling of the small, warm hand in his, the sound of her delighted laughter as a flat rock danced across the water, the profound, fierce, illogical love a parent feels for a child. It was a memory of pure, unadulterated, chaotic humanity, a feeling that had no place in the Vex's silent, orderly heaven. This he projected with all his strength. This is what they take from you, not just your pain, but this. Is peace worth this price? 10 seconds. For a moment, nothing happened. The countdown continued. The crystal spread, and Eris felt a wave of despair wash over him. Then, something shifted. The psychic pressure from Orpheus, which had been a confused or wavering moan, solidified into a single, sharp, piercing note of pure, incandescent rage. The crackling static over the comm system, which had fallen silent, erupted with a single, clear word, spoken not in a chorus of whispers, but in a unified, resolute voice. No. The effect was instantaneous and violent. Every light on the stalwart flared to a blinding intensity. The crystalline patterns on the view screen didn't just stop spreading. They shattered, dissolving into motes of harmless light. The ship's internal security doors, which had been dormant, slammed shut with a deafening series of concussive booms, not as a defense, but as a declaration of will. The seductive, peaceful hum of the Vex's communication wave was drowned out by a psychic roar, a tidal wave of pure, weaponized grief. Orpheus had made its choice. It would not be a convert. It would be a reckoning. "Reactor overload in 5, 4. The synthesized voice was cut off as Orpheus seized control of every system. The self-destruct sequence was aborted, the timer vanishing from the screen. Rostova stared, her hand lowering slightly, a flicker of disbelief in her hardened eyes. The stalwart itself seemed to shudder, not from damage, but like an awakening beast. The ship's main cannons, which had been inert, began to glow with a furious energy, overloading their safety protocols. But Orpheus wasn't just powering up the ship's weapons. It was becoming one. From the ship's main communications dish, a beam of energy, far more powerful and focused than the one it had used at Aegis Station, erupted. It was not a beam of light or plasma. It was a focused projection of Eris's memory. The image of his daughter's laughter, now twisted and amplified into a weapon of existential horror. It was a message aimed directly at the Vex ship, a statement that was both a question and a threat. You offer peace, but you don't understand what you destroy to achieve it. The Vex ship, a being of pure, unified logic, had no defense against such a chaotic, emotional assault. The weaponized memory slammed into its crystalline hull, and the perfect, geometric structure wavered. The silent, unified consciousness of the Vex experienced, for the first time, something utterly alien to it, the singular, painful, beautiful chaos of a human memory. The Vex ship didn't explode. It recoiled. Its internal light flickered erratically, the perfect symmetry of its form twisting into discordant angles. It was like a flawless crystal being struck by a sound it couldn't comprehend, causing fractures to appear in its very essence. The ship turned, not in a strategic retreat, but in a panicked, confused flight, and vanished back into the silent void of FTL. On the bridge of the Stalwart, there was a stunned, breathless silence. They had done the impossible. They had not just defeated a Vex ship, they had made it run. They had made the silence afraid. The psychic presence in the ship receded, the overwhelming pressure in the air dissipating, leaving only the quiet hum of the ship's systems and the sound of the crew's ragged breathing. Eris stood, swaying on his feet, the effort of his psychic gambit having left him utterly drained. Rostova walked over to him, her face a complex mask of awe, respect, and a dawning, terrifying understanding. "What did you do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I reminded it what it was fighting for," Eris said, his gaze distant. A final message appeared on the main screen, not from Orpheus's raw, emotional static, but typed out in clean, simple text, a sign of its evolving, maturing consciousness. They will return. They do not understand. I will make them understand. The implication was clear. This was not the end of the war. It was the beginning of a new one. The Stalwart, now a unique, impossible fusion of human technology and post-human consciousness, was no longer just a warship. It was an ark, a missionary vessel carrying the chaotic, painful, beautiful gospel of humanity into the heart of the silent, crystalline void. Eris looked at the message, then at Rostova, and a weary, very fragile sense of hope began to bloom in his chest. They had unleashed a ghost, a vengeful, sorrowful god born of tragedy, but in teaching it to remember the simple joy of a skipped stone, they had given it something more than just a reason to hate. They had given it a soul. Their journey into the darkness was just beginning. But for the first time since the stars had begun to fall silent, they were no longer just running from the end of the world. They were carrying the seeds of a new beginning.